The autumn sunlight streamed through the windows of room 203 at Roosevelt High School, where Miss Karen Thompson's English literature class was discussing To Kill a Mockingbird. The clock on the wall showed 10:45 a.m., and the air felt heavy with tension that Thursday morning. Marcus Williams, a junior known for his sharp mind and calm demeanor, sat in the third row. His crisp blue shirt and neat appearance reflected his usual attention to detail. As the top student in the class, he had earned respect from both teachers and peers for his thoughtful contributions and leadership in the school's debate team. The trouble began when Miss Thompson, a 52-year-old teacher with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, started discussing the historical context of the novel. Her voice, usually controlled and professional, carried an edge that morning. Students noticed she seemed more irritable than usual, her hands shaking slightly as she wrote on the whiteboard. The book's language reflects its time period, Miss Thompson said, pacing between the rows of desks. We must understand the historical significance. Marcus raised his hand. Miss Thompson, I think it's important to discuss how these harmful words still impact people today. My research paper focuses on modern-day racism in literature. The classroom grew quiet. Several students nodded in agreement with Marcus, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sarah Chen, sitting near the window, slowly reached for her phone, sensing the growing tension. Miss Thompson's face reddened. Mr. Williams, we're discussing the book as it was written. Your modern interpretations aren't relevant to this particular lesson. But isn't it crucial to connect historical context to present-day experiences? Marcus persisted politely. It helps us understand why certain words and attitudes are harmful. The teacher's fingers gripped her desk, knuckles turning white. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across her face, highlighting the deep frown lines around her mouth. You're disrupting my class with your personal agenda. It's not a personal agenda, Miss Thompson, Marcus replied calmly. It's about making literature relevant to our lives today. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Miss Thompson's face contorted with anger, her professional facade crumbling completely. The racial slur exploded from her lips, echoing through the suddenly silent classroom. 27 pairs of eyes widened in shock. Marcus sat perfectly still, his expression frozen. The only movement was his right hand, slowly closing his textbook. Around him, phones emerged from pockets and backpacks, their cameras capturing the unthinkable moment. Jasmine Rodriguez, Marcus's best friend since middle school, gasped audibly. Tyler Bennett dropped his pencil, the clatter seeming unusually loud in the stunned silence. Even the birds outside the window seemed to stop chirping. Miss Thompson's own eyes widened as she realized what she'd said. Her hand flew to her mouth, but it was too late. The word hung in the air like poison, captured forever on dozens of phone cameras. Marcus stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. At 6 feet tall, he towered over his seated classmates, but his movements remained graceful and controlled. Without a word, he gathered his books, placed them carefully in his backpack, and walked toward the door. Marcus, Miss Thompson started, her voice trembling. He paused at the doorway, turned slightly, and spoke in a clear, steady voice that everyone would remember later. I'll be speaking with Principal Roberts now. And then I'm calling my mother, Dr. Williams. She's a civil rights attorney. His words carried no anger, just quiet determination. The door closed behind him with a soft click. The remaining students sat in shocked silence for exactly 3 seconds before the room erupted. Chairs scraped against the floor as several students stood up. Phones buzzed as text messages and videos began spreading through the school's social networks. Outside in the hallway, other teachers emerged from their classrooms, drawn by the commotion. Miss Thompson stood rooted to her spot, her face ashen, as her 27-year teaching career imploded in a single moment of unforgivable rage. Her hands trembled as she reached for her desk for support. Down the hallway, Marcus walked steadily toward the principal's office, his footsteps echoing against the lockers. His phone buzzed continuously in his pocket. News traveled fast in high school, but he didn't check it. Instead, he focused on breathing steadily, keeping his head high, just as his parents had taught him. The morning sun continued to shine through the windows, indifferent to the life-changing events it illuminated. In room 203, the copy of To Kill a Mockingbird lay open on Marcus's empty desk, its pages fluttering slightly in the breeze from the air conditioning, a silent witness to how the past and present had collided in ways its author could never have imagined. The next 30 minutes at Roosevelt High School moved at lightning speed. Marcus's quiet footsteps to the principal's office had triggered a chain of events that rippled through the building like a shockwave. In the main office, Mrs. Garcia, the school secretary for 15 years, looked up as Marcus entered. She immediately noticed his unusually stiff posture and the tight set of his jaw. "Marcus, is everything all right?" Before he could answer, his phone buzzed again. This time he checked it. 37 text messages, 12 missed calls, and the video had already reached every corner of the school. Taking a deep breath, he looked at Mrs. Garcia. "I need to see Principal Roberts. It's urgent." Down the hall in room 203, chaos had erupted. Miss Thompson sat at her desk, her face buried in her hands, while students gathered their things and began leaving despite her weak protests. Jasmine Rodriguez, still recording on her phone, stood up and announced, "I'm going to find Marcus." Several others followed her lead. The video spread faster than anyone could have predicted. By 11 a.m., it had reached every phone in Roosevelt High. Students in other classrooms watched it under their desks, their shocked gasps causing other teachers to pause their lessons. Principal Roberts, a tall woman with silver-streaked hair, was in the middle of a budget meeting when her phone started buzzing nonstop. Opening one of the many incoming messages, she watched the video with growing horror. Without a word to the budget committee, she stood up and hurried to her office, arriving just as Marcus was explaining the situation to Mrs. Garcia. "Marcus, come in immediately," she said, holding her door open. As they entered her office, she could hear the growing commotion in the hallways. "Mrs. Garcia, please call Vice Principal Chen and Dean Williams to my office right now." Inside the office, Marcus sat straight-backed in the chair, his hands folded neatly in his lap. "I'd like to call my mother," he said quietly. Principal Roberts nodded, already reaching for her office phone. But before she could dial, her cell phone rang. It was Dr. Williams herself. The video had already reached her law office downtown. "I'm on my way," Dr. Williams said, her voice carrying the calm authority that had won her numerous civil rights cases. "Don't let anyone question my son without me present." In the hallways, the situation was escalating. Students had begun gathering outside room 203, their phones held high, recording Miss Thompson through the classroom windows. Vice Principal Chen arrived, quickly dispersing the crowd. "Return to your classrooms immediately," he ordered, his voice firm but concerned. Inside room 203, Miss Thompson hadn't moved from her desk. The racial slur she'd uttered seemed to echo in her ears, growing louder with each passing minute. When Vice Principal Chen entered, she looked up with tear-stained cheeks. "I don't know what happened," she whispered. I lost control." By 11:15 a.m., local news vans were already pulling into the school parking lot. Someone had sent them the video. Mrs. Garcia watched from her window as reporters began setting up their equipment, their faces eager for the developing story. The school's phones started ringing nonstop. Parents called, demanding answers. Other teachers stopped by the office, their faces showing mixture of shock and concern. The school district superintendent's office called 3 times in 10 minutes. At 11:20 a.m., Dr. Williams arrived. She walked through the school doors with purposeful strides, her navy blue suit and briefcase marking her as the accomplished attorney she was. Students in the hallway parted like the Red Sea, phones recording her determined walk to the principal's office. Marcus looked up as his mother entered Principal Roberts' office. Their eyes met, and for a moment, his carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. Dr. Williams placed a gentle hand on his shoulder before turning to face Principal Roberts. "My son will not be returning to Ms. Thompson's class," she stated firmly, "and we'll be discussing comprehensive changes to prevent incidents like this in the future." Principal Roberts nodded, her computer screen showing dozens of newly arrived emails from concerned parents and school board members. Outside her office, she could hear the growing buzz of media attention and student voices. The morning's events had sparked a fire that would change Roosevelt High forever. As Marcus sat beside his mother, listening to her outline their next steps, he realized that his quiet Thursday morning had transformed into something much bigger than himself. The video continued to spread, and with each share, the demand for change grew louder. The clock on Principal Roberts' wall showed 11:30 a.m. In less than an hour, a single moment of hatred had exposed deep-rooted issues that could no longer be ignored. The real work was just beginning. By 2:00 p.m. that same day, Roosevelt High School had become the center of a storm. The school board's emergency meeting was scheduled for 4:00 p.m., but board members were already arriving, their faces grim as they passed through crowds of protesters gathering outside the administration building. Miss Thompson sat alone in the teacher's lounge, a letter of administrative leave clutched in her trembling hands. Her coffee sat untouched, growing cold on the table. Outside the window, she could see students holding signs that read "No place for hate" and "Education without discrimination." Principal Roberts paced in her office, preparing for the board meeting. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since morning. On her desk lay printed copies of the school's anti-discrimination policies, student complaints from previous years, and Ms. Thompson's personnel file. The security footage from the hallway outside room 203 played silently on her computer screen. "The media wants statements," Mrs. Garcia said, poking her head into the office. "Channel 5 is live outside, and the Chronicle is called 4 times." At 3:30 p.m., Dr. Williams arrived with Marcus for the board meeting. They weren't alone. Behind them walked Reverend Jackson from the local Baptist church, 2 representatives from the NAACP, and 3 civil rights attorneys from Dr. Williams's firm. Their presence sent whispers through the crowded hallways. The school board meeting room, usually quiet and half empty, was packed. Every seat was filled, with people standing along the walls. Board members sat at their elevated desk, looking down at the crowd. Chairman Richard Peterson, who had served on the board for 20 years, adjusted his microphone. "This emergency session of the Roosevelt High School Board will come to order," he announced, his voice echoing through the tense room. Camera flashes went off as photographers captured the moment. Miss Thompson entered through a side door, accompanied by her union representative. She looked smaller somehow, her shoulders hunched, her earlier anger replaced by visible fear. Some people in the crowd booed, while others just stared silently. Marcus sat between his parents in the front row. His father, Dr. James Williams, a respected surgeon, had left the hospital early to attend. The family's presence commanded attention, their dignity in the face of hatred making a powerful statement. Chairman Peterson cleared his throat. "We're here to address the incident that occurred this morning in Ms. Karen Thompson's English literature class. We have reviewed the video evidence and—" "Video evidence?" Ms. Thompson's union representative interrupted. "Those cell phone recordings were taken without consent." A murmur of disagreement rippled through the crowd. Dr. Williams stood up, her voice clear and controlled. "Security cameras in the hallway captured my son leaving the classroom. 27 students witnessed the incident. The evidence is undeniable." The board members whispered among themselves. Vice Chairman Gloria Martinez leaned forward to her microphone. "Miss Thompson, would you like to make a statement?" Miss Thompson stood slowly, her voice barely audible. I lost my temper. I've been teaching for 27 years. I never meant to." "Intent doesn't erase impact," Dr. Williams interjected. "My son was subjected to racial abuse by someone in a position of authority." Outside, the crowd of protesters had grown larger. Their chants could be heard through the windows. "No more hate. Educate." Principal Roberts presented the board with a thick folder. "We have documentation of 3 previous incidents involving Ms. Thompson making inappropriate comments. They were handled internally at the time, but in light of today's events." The meeting continued for 2 hours. Students testified about past experiences. Parents demanded action. Community leaders called for systemic changes. Through it all, Marcus sat quietly, his presence a powerful reminder of why they were all there. Finally, Chairman Peterson spoke. "The board has reached a decision. Ms. Thompson is suspended without pay pending a full investigation. Additionally, we will be implementing mandatory cultural sensitivity training for all staff members." But Dr. Williams wasn't finished. She stood again, commanding the room's attention. "That's not enough. We need comprehensive reform. New hiring practices, curriculum changes, regular diversity audits. This incident exposed deeper problems that must be addressed." The board members looked at each other uneasily. Chairman Peterson nodded slowly. "We will establish a task force to examine these issues." Dr. Williams, Would you be willing to serve as co-chair? As the meeting adjourned, reporters rushed to get statements. Outside, the protesters cheered as word of the decision spread. Marcus walked out with his parents, his head held high. The day's events had set changes in motion that would reshape Roosevelt High School forever. Miss Thompson left through the back door, alone, her career and reputation in ruins. The setting sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as she walked to her car, marked by the first media reports already appearing on local news websites. The local community center buzzed with energy on Saturday evening, just 2 days after the incident. Every chair in the large meeting hall was occupied, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. The town hall meeting, hastily organized by community leaders, had drawn over 300 residents. Reverend Jackson stood at the podium, his deep voice carrying to the back of the room. "We're not here just to talk about one teacher's actions," he said, looking across the sea of faces. "We're here to address the deeper issues in our educational system." In the front row, Marcus sat with his family, now joined by his grandmother, Mrs. Rose Williams, a retired teacher who had fought her own battles against discrimination in the 1960s. Her presence added historical weight to the evening's discussions. Sarah Martinez, a former student of Ms. Thompson's from 5 years ago, approached the microphone. Her hands shook as she spoke. "I never told anyone this before, but she made subtle racist comments in class all the time. I was too scared to speak up." A murmur went through the crowd. More former students lined up behind the microphone, each with their own story to tell. Some had graduated years ago, but the pain in their voices remained fresh. Principal Roberts sat in the audience, taking careful notes. Her usual professional demeanor couldn't hide her growing distress as she listened to story after story of incidents that had gone unreported or unaddressed. "My daughter came home crying 3 times last semester," said Mr. Chen, rising from his seat. "Now I understand why. How many children have suffered in silence?" Local news cameras captured every moment. Reporter Lisa Kim from Channel 5 stood in the corner, speaking quietly into her microphone. "The incident at Roosevelt High has opened a floodgate of similar experiences, suggesting a pattern that spans decades." Dr. Williams took the podium next, her legal background lending authority to her words. "Change doesn't happen without action," she declared. "We're establishing a community oversight committee to work with the school board. We need volunteers." Hands shot up across the room. Teachers, parents, students, and community leaders all volunteered to help. The energy in the room shifted from anger to determination. Marcus watched as Mrs. Rose Williams slowly made her way to the microphone. The room fell silent as his grandmother, leaning slightly on her cane, began to speak. "I taught in segregated schools," she said, her voice strong despite her age. "I watched as integration brought hope and new challenges. Now, my grandson faces the same hatred I thought we'd left behind. It's time to do better." Tears flowed freely in the audience. Even the reporters lowered their cameras, moved by her words. Outside the community center, a group of students from Roosevelt High had set up tables with petitions. They collected signatures demanding curriculum changes, better hiring practices, and mandatory cultural sensitivity training. Their organization showed that the younger generation was ready to take action. Back inside, Principal Roberts stood up. "I want to announce that Roosevelt High will be hosting weekly diversity and inclusion workshops. We're partnering with civil rights organizations to develop new training programs." The announcement received applause, but some community members called for more immediate action. Mr. Washington, owner of a local bookstore, suggested a complete audit of the school's hiring practices and curriculum. As the meeting continued, Marcus noticed something important happening. People weren't just talking about problems. They were making plans. Teachers offered to revise their lesson plans. Parents volunteered to monitor classrooms. Students proposed forming a diversity council. Near the end of the meeting, Jasmine Rodriguez, who had recorded the original incident, shared the latest news. Her video had gone viral nationally, sparking similar conversations in schools across the country. Roosevelt High had become the center of a much larger movement. Dr. James Williams, Marcus's father, made the final speech of the evening. "My son showed incredible dignity in the face of hatred," he said, his voice filled with both pride and sadness. "Now it's our turn to show the same courage in making real changes." As people began to leave, They signed up for various committees and action groups. The community center's walls were covered with sign-up sheets and action plans. What had started as a response to one incident had grown into a movement for systemic change. Marcus watched as his grandmother hugged tearful former students who shared their stories. Reporters interviewed community leaders about next steps. Principal Roberts exchanged contact information with civil rights organizations. The evening ended, but everyone knew this was just the beginning. The community had found its voice, and they weren't going to be silent anymore. As the lights dimmed in the community center, the glow of determination shone bright in the eyes of everyone who had attended. Copyretry, Monday morning arrived with a different atmosphere at Roosevelt High School. 2 investigators from the Department of Education sat in the conference room, their laptops open and recording devices ready. On the table before them lay stacks of files, 20 years of teacher evaluations, student complaints, and disciplinary records. Ms. Sandra Chen, the lead investigator, adjusted her glasses as she reviewed another document. We found 15 previous incidents involving Ms. Thompson, she told Principal Roberts. Most were never fully investigated. Down the hall, Marcus met with the school board special committee. His mother, Dr. Williams, sat beside him as he calmly described not just the Slur incident, but smaller moments of bias he'd noticed throughout the year. His words were measured, his memory clear. She would always call on the white students first, he explained. When I raised my hand, she'd say we needed to move on to the next topic. The investigator's presence brought forward more stories. Teachers who had witnessed previous incidents but stayed quiet now felt compelled to speak. Mrs. Johnson, the school librarian, revealed how she had overheard Ms. Thompson making racist comments in the teacher's lounge multiple times. I regret not reporting it earlier, Mrs. Johnson said, wiping tears from her eyes. I was afraid of causing trouble. By lunchtime, a pattern emerged. The investigators created a timeline on the conference room wall using sticky notes. Yellow notes showed reported incidents. Pink notes showed unreported ones. Blue notes marked times when complaints were filed but ignored. The wall looked like a colorful map of systemic failure. Principal Roberts sat at her desk, reviewing old emails with growing dismay. Signs had been there all along: parent complaints, student transfers out of Ms. Thompson's class, subtle warnings from other teachers. She had missed them all. We were blind, she admitted to the investigators. Or maybe we chose not to see. Outside the school, local news crews maintained their vigil. Reporter Lisa Kim interviewed Dr. James Williams during his lunch break from the hospital. As a surgeon, I'm required to maintain strict professional standards, he said. Why should teachers be held to any less? The investigation spread beyond Ms. Thompson. The team looked into hiring practices, promotion patterns, and discipline records. They found troubling disparities in how students of different races were treated. By afternoon, Ms. Thompson's union representative arrived with a thick folder of her own. My client has decided to resign, she announced to the school board. But she maintains that her words were taken out of context. Dr. Williams, who had been reviewing the investigation's preliminary findings, looked up sharply. There is no context that makes racial slurs acceptable, she stated firmly. Especially not from an educator. Marcus spent his afternoon meeting with student government representatives. Together, they compiled a report about their experiences, documenting subtle forms of discrimination they'd witnessed or experienced. Their youth didn't make their observations any less valid. We see things adults miss sometimes, Marcus explained to investigator Chen. We just didn't know how to speak up before. As the day wound down, the investigators gathered in the conference room for their final meeting of the day. The evidence was overwhelming. Not only had Ms. Thompson shown a pattern of discriminatory behavior, but the school system had repeatedly failed to address it. Principal Roberts joined them, looking tired but determined. What do we do next? She asked. Sandra Chen closed her laptop slowly. Based on our findings, we're recommending a complete overhaul of your anti-discrimination policies. This goes beyond one teacher. In the parking lot, Marcus and his mother prepared to leave. They watched as investigators carried boxes of documents to their cars. The setting sun cast long shadows across the school building. Do you think this will make a difference? Marcus asked quietly. Dr. Williams squeezed his shoulder. Change happens in layers, she said. First, we expose the problem. Then we fix the system that allowed it. As they drove home, Marcus's phone buzzed with messages from other students. The investigation had given many of them courage to share their own stories. Each message represented another piece of evidence, another voice demanding change. The investigation wasn't just about punishing one teacher anymore. It had become a spotlight, illuminating years of overlooked problems and missed opportunities for change. As night fell over Roosevelt High, the investigators' findings would ensure that tomorrow would be different from all the yesterdays that came before. Sandra Chen made one final note in her report. This incident opened a door. Now it's up to the school community to walk through it. She closed her notebook, knowing that her report would help shape the future of not just Roosevelt High, but potentially schools across the state. 1 week after the investigation concluded, the school board gathered for their most important meeting in years. The auditorium was filled to capacity, with local news cameras positioned at the back and community members filling every available seat. Chairman Peterson stood at the podium, holding the final investigation report. After careful review of all evidence, he began, his voice echoing through the speakers. The board has reached several decisions that will take effect immediately. The room fell silent. Marcus, sitting between his parents in the front row, leaned forward slightly. Behind him sat dozens of students who had come forward with their own stories during the investigation. First, Chairman Peterson announced, "Ms. Thompson's employment is officially terminated. Her teaching license will be reviewed by the State Board of Education." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but this was just the beginning. The chairman continued, "However, this incident exposed larger issues that demand broader action." Dr. Williams nodded approvingly as Peterson outlined the comprehensive changes. Her legal pad was ready to take notes, ensuring every promise would be kept. Effective immediately, we're implementing mandatory cultural sensitivity training for all staff members, from custodians to administrators. This isn't a one-time seminar, it's ongoing education. Principal Roberts, seated on stage with other administrators, watched as her staff members exchanged glances. Some looked uncomfortable, others relieved. Change was coming, whether they were ready or not. Furthermore, Peterson continued, "We're establishing a diversity oversight committee. Dr. Williams has agreed to chair this committee, along with student representative Marcus Williams." Marcus sat up straighter as people turned to look at him. His appointment wasn't just symbolic, he would have real power to help shape school policies. The chairman went on to list more changes. New hiring practices requiring diverse interview panels, curriculum reviews to ensure inclusive content, and a clear system for reporting and investigating discrimination complaints. Jasmine Rodriguez, who had recorded the original incident, whispered to her friend, "This is actually happening. They're really making changes." In the middle of the auditorium, Mrs. Rose Williams dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. After decades of fighting for equality in education, she was watching real change unfold. Principal Roberts approached the podium next. "As head of Roosevelt High, I take full responsibility for not addressing these issues sooner. Starting tomorrow, my door will always be open to students who need to report concerns." The local news reporter, Lisa Kim, spoke quietly into her microphone. In an unprecedented move, Roosevelt High School is setting new standards for accountability and inclusion in education. As the meeting continued, more specific details emerged. Every teacher would undergo an evaluation of their classroom practices. Security cameras would be installed in all classrooms, not for surveillance, but for accountability. A new position was created, Director of Diversity and Inclusion. Near the end of the meeting, Marcus was invited to speak. He walked to the podium calmly, just as he had walked out of Ms. Thompson's classroom that day. "What happened to me was wrong," he said simply. "But what happens next is more important. We have a chance to make sure it never happens again." The audience broke into applause. Even the school board members had to wipe away tears. After the meeting, groups gathered in the parking lot, discussing the changes. Teachers formed committees to revise their lesson plans. Parents signed up for volunteer positions on various oversight boards. Dr. Williams spoke with reporters while Marcus stood nearby. "This isn't just about punishment," she explained. "It's about creating lasting change. Every student deserves to feel safe and respected in their classroom." Principal Roberts caught up with Marcus as they were leaving. "We need your help," she said earnestly. "Your generation sees things differently. You can help us build a better school. The next morning, Roosevelt High felt different. Signs went up announcing the first cultural sensitivity training session. The guidance office was flooded with students wanting to join the new diversity committee. Teachers gathered in small groups, discussing how to make their classrooms more inclusive. Ms. Thompson's classroom, room 203, was being repainted. The new teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, a young Latina educator with a master's in inclusive education, would start next week. As Marcus walked to his first class, other students nodded respectfully. He wasn't just the student who had been wronged anymore, he was part of the solution. The weight of this responsibility sat comfortably on his shoulders, much like the new student council pin on his collar. The morning announcements crackled over the speakers. Remember, the first diversity committee meeting is today after school. All are welcome. It was a small change, but it signaled the beginning of something much bigger. 3 months after the incident, Roosevelt High School had become a different place. The hallways displayed new posters celebrating diversity, but the real changes went much deeper than decorations. Marcus stood at the front of the school auditorium, addressing a group of educators from across the state. Our story isn't just about what went wrong, he explained, his confidence growing with each word. It's about how we made things right. Behind him, a slideshow displayed the school's transformation. Pictures showed students from different backgrounds leading discussion groups, teachers attending cultural sensitivity workshops, and community members participating in school events. Principal Roberts, sitting in the audience, felt pride as she watched her school being showcased as a model for change. The painful incident that had started everything now seemed like a distant memory. In the newly formed Cultural Understanding Club, students gathered during lunch breaks to share their experiences and learn from each other. Today, they were planning a multicultural festival for the upcoming weekend. Who would have thought, Jasmine said, arranging festival flyers, that one terrible moment would lead to all this good? The changes weren't just visible in special events. In classrooms, teachers had transformed their teaching styles. History classes now included diverse perspectives. Literature classes featured authors from various backgrounds. Science classes discussed contributions from scientists of all races and cultures. Ms. Rodriguez, who had replaced Ms. Thompson, created an inclusive environment where every student felt heard. Her classroom walls featured quotes from diverse authors, and her teaching style encouraged open dialogue about difficult topics. During one particularly meaningful morning, Mrs. Rose Williams visited the school to share her experiences fighting for civil rights. Students sat captivated as she connected past struggles to present changes. "When I was your age," she told them, "we couldn't imagine a school like this. You're not just learning history, you're making it." The school's reputation began to change in the community. Parents who had been hesitant to send their children to Roosevelt High now sought enrollment. Other schools sent representatives to learn from their diversity programs. Dr. Williams, still chairing the Diversity Oversight Committee, worked closely with school administrators to monitor progress. "We're seeing real change," she reported during a board meeting. "Incident reports are down, student participation is up, and test scores are improving." Marcus found himself becoming a leader without really trying. Younger students looked up to him, teachers valued his input, and even other schools invited him to speak about student advocacy. One day, as he walked past room 203, he paused. The room where everything had started now symbolized transformation. Through the window, he could see students of all backgrounds engaged in lively discussion, their hands raised eagerly to contribute. The school newspaper ran a special edition highlighting the changes. The headline read, "Roosevelt High, From Crisis to Community." The article featured interviews with students, teachers, and parents about the positive changes they witnessed. During a parent-teacher conference night, the halls buzzed with different languages and conversations. Parents who had never felt comfortable in the school before now actively participated in school events. Principal Roberts often reflected on how far they'd come. Her office, once a place where problems were hidden, now had an open-door policy. Students regularly stopped by to share ideas or raise concerns. The transformation reached beyond Roosevelt High. Other schools in the district began adopting similar programs. The State Board of Education used their model to create new guidelines for cultural sensitivity training. One afternoon, as Marcus led a student council meeting, he noticed something remarkable. The room was filled with students from every background, working together, their differences making them stronger rather than dividing them. This is what education should look like, he thought, watching his classmates collaborate on a new project. As the school day ended, the afternoon announcements included a reminder. Tomorrow's Unity Assembly will celebrate our school's journey. Everyone has a story to tell, and every story matters. Students filed out of the building, chatting and laughing together. Above them, a new banner hung proudly. Roosevelt High, where every voice counts. The words weren't just a slogan anymore, they were a reality. 6 months had passed since that fateful day in room 203. The morning sun shone brightly on Roosevelt High as Marcus walked up the steps for an important ceremony. The school had been chosen to receive the State Excellence in Education Award for their groundbreaking diversity initiatives. The auditorium was packed with familiar faces. Principal Roberts stood at the podium, beaming with pride. Next to her sat Dr. Williams, whose legal expertise had helped reshape not just Roosevelt High, but schools across the state. Today marks more than just receiving an award, Principal Roberts began. It marks the beginning of a new chapter in education. In the front row, Marcus adjusted his graduation cap. The past 6 months had changed his life in unexpected ways. The letter in his pocket proved it. A full scholarship to Harvard University, where he planned to study education and civil rights law. The state education commissioner stepped forward to present the award. Roosevelt High has shown us that from darkness can come light, she announced. Their response to crisis has become a model for schools nationwide. Screens around the auditorium displayed the changes. Diversity training programs now mandatory in all state schools, new hiring practices ensuring teacher diversity, and curriculum changes reflecting multiple perspectives. Roosevelt High had started a movement. Mrs. Rose Williams watched from her seat, tears in her eyes. Her grandson had turned a moment of hate into a legacy of hope. Next to her, Dr. James Williams held her hand, equally proud of how their family had helped transform their community. After the ceremony, Marcus led visitors on a tour of the school. They stopped at the newly renamed Unity Hall, formerly known as the hallway where he had walked out of Ms. Thompson's class. Now it displayed student artwork celebrating different cultures and histories. The most important change, Marcus explained to the visitors, isn't in the building. It's in how we think and treat each other. Local news reporter Lisa Kim, who had covered the story from the beginning, interviewed students for a special report. Roosevelt High's transformation shows what's possible when communities unite against discrimination, she reported. Principal Roberts shared exciting news during the tour. The school's new policies had been adopted by the State Board of Education. Starting next year, every school would have a student-led diversity council and mandatory cultural sensitivity training. In the guidance office, a wall of college acceptance letters showed another kind of progress. More students from minority backgrounds were being accepted into top universities than ever before. Marcus's Harvard acceptance was displayed prominently, inspiring younger students. As the day drew to a close, the school gathered for one final assembly. Dr. Williams took the stage to make an announcement. Today, we're launching the Roosevelt Scholarship Fund, she said. Every year, it will help students who show leadership in promoting equality and understanding. Marcus was named the first recipient, but he immediately donated it to create a second scholarship. This was never about me, he said. It's about making sure every student has a voice and a chance. Outside, news vans prepared to broadcast the evening's coverage. Roosevelt High's story had captured national attention, proving that positive change was possible when communities stood together against discrimination. As students left school that day, they passed under a new motto painted above the entrance. Learning from yesterday, leading for tomorrow. The words seemed to glow in the afternoon sun. Marcus paused at the top of the steps, looking back at the school. In just 6 months, a moment of hatred had transformed into a movement of hope. As he walked home with his family, he knew that Roosevelt High's story would continue to inspire change long after he graduated. The setting sun cast long shadows across the school grounds, but unlike 6 months ago, these shadows didn't carry darkness. They promised a new dawn of understanding, acceptance, and unity for generations to come.